Shalom and welcome to Jerusalem Studio. The Syrian civil war seems to be fast approaching its end, with various battles involving the Assad regime, the Islamist militias, Iran and its proxies, as well as neighboring Israel and Turkey continuing. But to further discuss the latest developments of this conflict, I'm joined here in the studio by Lieutenant Colonel in Reserve Reuven Ben Shalom, who is a cross-cultural strategist and a columnist at the Jerusalem Post. Welcome. I'd like also to welcome our TV7 analyst, Mr. Amir Oren, and Professor Zeev Hanin, who is an expert on Russian and Middle Eastern studies at Ilan and Ariel universities. Welcome.
My pleasure.
Mr. Oren, give us a broader understanding or a broader update on the latest developments in Syria.
As usual, there is some tension and perhaps even some confusion between the immediate and the important. What is important in Syria is that the civil war, after almost 8 years, seems to be entering its very last stages, with Bashar Assad victorious, thanks to his Russian and Iranian friends, as well as Hezbollah. But the formula for sharing the political power is yet to be finished, and therefore, while the Russians and others are working towards such a formula in order to stabilize Syria, battles are still going on. The focus right now is on southwest Syria. Of course, there is also in the north, in the Idlib area, and next to the Turkish border, there are still battles going on. But right now, the real fight is between the Assad regime, propped by the Russians and the Iranians, and the Al-Qaeda affiliate in this area. They are close. The Assad regime is closing in on the bastions of the rebels next to the Israeli border, and therefore there is heightened tension between Israel, Syria, and Iran in that region, which is the Quneitra and Sueda districts.
Colonel Ben Shalom?
When I look at the situation, personally, it's hard for me to understand why the rebels or all the factions go on fighting. Because we see how the war unfolded, we see the tactics used, and together with Russia and Iran, by the way, they plan, they declare what they're going to do, and then they go and they carry it out, and they reclaim every territory they say they will, barrel bomb, and ultimately go in on the ground and take it over. Very devastating on the ground. Israel's involved not only on our strategic aspects, but also on humanitarian aspects on the ground. But when you look at what's going on now in the south, I really can't understand why they even go on. You have to admire, in a way, the resolve of these people, of these various factions that are continuing to fight till the end, and ultimately it will be the end. It's over, the game over. Interesting that we Israelis, for years, we would say Assad's days are numbered. Well, of course, this is no longer the case. He's back. In a way, it's almost clear that we're going to go back to a stability very similar to what we knew before. The only question, I agree that the long term is also, of course, more critical for us, with what components of Iran and Russia. And here, I think it's not as clear-cut as we thought. Russia said not long ago that all elements will have to leave, all forces will have to leave when this is over. And we said, excellent, because they mean Iran too. I no longer think that. I think Iran, in a way, is much more embedded now on the ground than Russia is. I think the day will come when Russia fulfill their goals, retreats, at least the overt forces, and Iran is in the field, on the ground, embedded with forces that will become local. So I think we're still with Iran for a long time.
Professor Hanin?
Well, I think we have to hear two problems. One problem is that everybody is talking about the day after, but this day after is not here, is not with us. We're still there. And it's not pretty clear whether the Islamic State is out. It's not pretty clear whether the opposition is out. And even more important, all the big powers that are involved in the crisis in Syria and the civil war, directly or with the help of their proxies or protecting this or that groups of the opposition over pro-Assad forces, they're saying that we are eager to do as quick as possible to transfer all this function to outsourcing and to leave. Americans say that, Russians say that, and the Turkish say that, but nobody is going. So the question is what will happen on the next day, which is not going to be tomorrow. The second point, I would like to address what Reuven said about the Russian position there. I believe that Russia is not interested in transforming Syria into the satellite of Iran. That's what was not agreed from the very beginning. they were used Iranians as their strong force in order to help to save their Assad government. Russia was unable, concerning the Crimea issue, the Ukraine, and some conflict with the Europeans, the gas issues, and so on and so forth, to make the stories more or less similar with what happened in Afghanistan or Chechnya. But still, it was pretty clear, and now it's pretty clear that they are going to be a subject which is keeping a sort of a balance between various interests in Syria. So Russians are not going anywhere, but they would, and they believe that Iranians are not going anywhere, but not in the same scope and at the same scale as they are now. What I heard from Moscow, and they are writing quite a lot about that, and spoke with a couple of people, so they say the following. Absolutely openly. They said that we discussed it in the studio that Russians see that they have two allies in the Middle East. One is Iran and second is Israel. Russia is not the Soviet Union and they're unable to stand on one leg in any territory, so they need both. So it's pretty good. One of the guys pretty close to how we would define it, analytical circles close to Kremlin. He said that different sides, Israelis, Americans, and Iranians, are pressing us to make impossible thing. Like in this famous film, A Pretty Woman, impossible relations. So, they want either to get rid of one of them, Iranians, or bring two things together, two subjects together. We're unable to do either of them. The best thing would be that Mr. Netanyahu would agree to get this 100-kilometer zone of non-presence of any other forces but Mr. Assad forces. And of course, nobody is present in this territory area of 1974 lines. But on the other side, out of this 100, you requested in Sochi, you requested in Moscow, you requested in our meetings that it should be between 40 and 60. We give you 100. So, but more than that, please rely on us. We will have a look on Iranians, but they're not going anywhere. Mr. Netanyahu says no. We would like Iranians not to be present there, and if you are unable to do that, we are keeping liberty to do what we are able to do and what we are interested to do.
All options on the table, indeed.
Yeah.
Mr. Oren, I'd like to take a few steps backwards before we start discussing the day after, as Professor Hanin has also noted that we're far from over from the battles on the ground. We have, of course, the Islamic State that raised its head just recently once more in multiple attack on Sweda and different areas of Jabal al-Druz and Jabal al-Arab, which has claimed the lives of more than 250 people. And of course, they managed also to kidnap, but they showed that they still have the capacity of exerting significant damage. To what degree do they, including other Islamist groups and other extreme Muslim groups, if you will, that are currently operating in southern Israel, continue their battle for the sake of Islam in their ideology and their mythology of exerting that religion on their territories?
This is one of at least two paradoxes, because the first paradox, of course, is that Iran is an ally of Israel and the United States against the Islamic State. Israel would like, of course, to see all of its enemies out, but nevertheless, there are priorities. And the Islamic State in Syria is the great Satan, while Iran is only the small or little Satan. Now, the other paradox is that when one power, one local factor is weak, the others do not concentrate on it. And therefore, it gets its strength back and becomes a renewed threat, which is what happened with the remnants of the Islamic State, as well as Jabhat al-Nusra, which is, or Shuhadat al-Yarmouk, which are more Al-Qaeda than Islamic State. But let me go back to what Professor Hanin said regarding the separation zone between Israel and Syria per the 1974 agreement. You, Jonathan, were at Helsinki during the Putin-Trump summit. When they came out to the press, there was a very distinct difference between what they said, even though they were supposed to read from the same script, what they said regarding this 1974 agreement between Israel and Syria. President Trump only mentioned the modalities on the ground, the separation of forces and the observers, the UN force, and so on. President Putin mentioned the political or diplomatic context. He specifically mentioned UN Security Council Resolution 338, which refers to 242 from 1967, which means territory for peace. What has he signaled by then? He signaled to Bashar Assad that when the war is over, when Syria is stabilized, and later on, the Golan Heights will go back to the negotiations table. It doesn't mean that right now the Russians are seeing it as a priority. They do not see it as a current item. But long range, at least in principle, it means that if Israel wants all foreign forces to be out of Syria, Russia wants Israel to remember that for it, as well as for the entire world, the United States either did not recognize Israeli control over the Golan Heights. Once Syria is back on its feet, Israel will have to enter negotiations on the Golan Heights again.
Colonel Ben Shalom, following the meeting between Trump and Putin, Putin also traveled to South Africa and spoke at the city of Johannesburg, where he stated that during the meeting with President Trump, he had the opportunity also to focus on different elements and on safeguarding the interests of various regional powers, including Israel, Turkey, Iran, and Syria itself, as he stated. To what degree do all powers in this region, if you can actually mention Syria amongst them, have a say in the future of Syria?
Well, I think this kind of war, one of the most complicated we've seen in the region, and we've had complexities here. When you look at the matrix of all the players, it's amazing. And I think we need to see this as a matrix of countries and interests, and it's very different from the way we used to see conflicts in the past, where there are sides, there are good guys, bad guys. Of course, as Israelis, we know we're always the good guys. But seriously, in this matrix, we are just another player. We also have to look at the geography and the size of each country. And Israel, even though we're strong and we're very relevant, and we have Putin's ear, which is amazing. I think this is a great accomplishment of the Israeli government. Bottom line, we have to look at our size and our influence. We're not a global power. And Russia is calling the shots now in Syria. So I think also inside of this matrix, there are other elements that maybe are more unique to us, and that is the issue of values. Because when I talked before about my so-called admiration maybe for some of the spirit of fighting there, don't forget we're talking about Al-Qaeda and ISIS and those kind of factors. Certainly,
which are most of those moderate rebels we're talking about.
Absolutely.
Usually.
Bad guys, okay, right. Bad guys. So I wouldn't say that we are aligned with Iran against them, but certainly if someone bombs ISIS, that's a positive thing, right? And what ISIS has been doing the last few days to the Druze, and also a complexity because we have a large Druze community inside of Israel that sees this with pain like all of us, but maybe more exerting pressure on the Israeli government. So this is a very complicated matrix. And I think, just to answer your question, I think the way to look at this is just by a calculation of interests and fulfilling certain interests and letting go of certain other interests and not saying I have to win in this or these are the good guys and these are the bad guys, so this has to be accomplished from A to Z. It just doesn't work like that. We also, in a way, Israelis have to learn to think like the others. We have to learn to think like Russians. Very calculated, these are my interests. We also have to value our rivals because Iran has clear interests and they are slowly but surely fulfilling them. Iran needs a stable Syria. They need that as a stepping ground to Lebanon, and they need to continue to support Hezbollah and arm Hezbollah through Damascus International. That's it. They need that place stable. They need a foothold, and they are fulfilling it. And sometimes Israel, when we bomb a few sites and we shoot down an Iranian drone and we think that by that we're succeeding against Iran, not so fast.
Fazl Hanin, the ambassador of Russia in Israel, had an interview with an Israeli media outlet during which he quite specifically informed the Israeli public that Russia, and specifically the Kremlin, doesn't see its capacity or interest, for that matter, to forcefully remove Iran from Syria. To what degree do Israelis and the Israeli government understand this statement?
First of all, I would like to say a word about what was said before with the two colleagues saying that Russians are very carefully calculated their interest in Syria. I think the same way Israelis as well were pretty careful to calculate their interest, at least while talking with the Russians. I cannot wait for the day in 20 years when Zeev will write a book about all these meetings between Prime Minister Netanyahu and President Vladimir Putin. But concerning the fact, okay, that means that, in fact, coming back to Russian ambassador, the previous ambassador never said a word about Russian position in Syria. But maybe except pronouncing very general slogans. I think that exchange of ambassadors also mean not just the end of the diplomatic career of the previous one, but also appointing the guy who is entrusted to explain to Israelis Russian agenda and, like we say in Hebrew, la'avir mesarim, to send their...
To pass the message.
To pass the messages. So from this point of view, I believe that Israeli position was presented in Kremlin very clearly, and at the same time, it was presented on the defense ministry of Russia also very clearly. So Netanyahu and Lieberman were very clear by saying what they want while talking to their counterparts. On the other capacity of Prime Minister Netanyahu as the foreign minister, talking to Mr. Lavrov, I believe he was also very clear. But Mr. Lavrov is talking on the Smolensk Square, where the Russian Foreign Office is situated. They're saying different things when we hear from Defense Ministry, General Headquarters, and from Kremlin. He said he probably read Tanakh, they probably read Holy Bible someday by saying, I'm not a defender of my brother, meaning that in fact, what was said in Kremlin is just a general declaration. In practical terms, we are unable to wipe Iranians out of there. So what I suggest, you Israelis, is just to take it as a reality, exactly as you took as a reality, as a fact. In the case of Mr. Assad, that he will stay here and will stay until we would like him to stay. So now you have to understand that more or less the same way, you should accept the presence of Iranians. We can discuss in what way, but in general, you have to accept it.
Mr. Oren, in several days, the United States will officially reimpose the sanctions on Iran as part of the pullout from the JCPOA, or the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, which is the technical term for the nuclear agreement with Iran. To what degree does that impact the Iranians in their ongoing conduct or their capacity to finance their ongoing conduct in Syria, and for that matter also in Lebanon to a certain degree, considering their full support of their proxy there, Hezbollah? And to what degree is this time around, which has shown already some fruit in certain levels, considering other countries that in the past didn't align themselves with the American sanctions now do, including India and such, do you believe that this time around the Iranians will be forced to think twice, considering also the drought that is occurring right now in Iran and the different uprisings around the country?
We shouldn't talk about the Iranians as a unitary actor, the way we justifiably do about the Russians and the Israelis, because there are at least two schools of thought in Iran. It was very interesting to see that when President Trump a few days ago tweeted at President Rouhani, he was answered by General Qassem Soleimani, who is, of course, the hardliner, and Soleimani's force, the Revolutionary Guard Quds force, is in Syria. President Rouhani would like the Iranian presence in Syria to go back to Iran. Of course, it doesn't need it. It's a heavy financial burden. We see the demonstrations in the streets in Iran. The Iranian government is under heavy economic and social pressure. Of course, it is not good for him. But Soleimani, who for the time being appears to enjoy the protection of the Supreme Leader Khamenei, insists on being there. Now, for the Russians, it wouldn't make sense to announce in advance that when the time comes, they will kick the Iranians out. They still need the Iranians in the fight, and it was mentioned here. What the Russians have in Syria are two forces, the Air Force and military police. They don't have combat troops on the ground. There are some mercenaries or volunteers or people in disguise, but they don't have units there. So they need the Iranians for the time being. Now, we know that Russians and Soviets before them are not very sentimental. When Lenin came to Russia in 1917, he took Russia out of World War I, which is what the Germans wanted. Stalin, of course, signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop agreement, and then he fought the Germans. It is no problem for Putin to be with the Iranians today and against the Iranians next year, but it would be unwise for him to declare it right now. So Netanyahu cannot expect such an announcement. But what the Russian ambassador said was not only what you quoted, but also what he didn't say. He didn't say we Russians are protecting the Iranian presence and you Israelis should not hit them. By default, he actually said, listen, Israel, you do what you need to do, we will do what we need to do, and it will sort out itself.
As long as they coordinate. Colonel Ben Shalom, when we're talking about the Syria conflict, we cannot but also include Turkey into the measurement. Right now, Turkey, of course, has its own interests in Syria, with the northern areas already conquered by the Turkish military, including swaths of land that have provided it some kind of a barrier from its border vis-a-vis the Kurdish troops in the more eastern part of the border and to the western part. Of course, the Russians and Syrians are in cahoots there, so they stay clear of that area, except for Idlib, of course. That is a question for all parties involved. To what degree does Turkey have an issue with Iran being in Syria right now?
Well, I think it is a major concern for them. It's sad that Turkey, instead of being a positive regional player and in a way sitting around the table with all of us and trying to make this place into a more stable place, Turkey has a stronger agenda. And I think, again, in this matrix of interests, their main agenda is going back to the days of being a regional dominant power. We should absolutely not make the mistake of calling Erdogan crazy, of course. No, he's a calculated leader like the rest. The problem is that just like Iran, he has strategic, long-term goals that he wants to accomplish. And these are not stability on the border. It's not looking at the map and talking about this or that area. He doesn't care about that. He cares about what's going to happen in 100 years with his newly rebuilt Ottoman Empire, or going back to the days or the concept of the empire. So I think that's what he's doing now, and I think we can hear this in his rhetoric, we can see this in his decisions, and it's almost like for us it's a wild card. That means the only way we can counter or put this into the calculation is just if we calibrate it to 100 years from now and understand that they're acting in that way and absolutely not measuring by what's happening today or tomorrow.
We also we usually speak about Sunni versus Shiite.
Right.
But there is also the moderate Sunnis, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, and the more extreme Sunnis like Turkey, the Muslim Brothers who are out of power in Egypt, Hamas in Gaza. So on the one hand, Erdogan is against Iran because they are Shiites, but on the other hand, he's trying to upset the moderate Sunni regimes.
Hanin?
We have a few countries, a few areas in the Middle East that are still fluctuating between the two ideas. What are they? They're nation states, or pretend to be nation states, or empires, that mean processes. I believe that Hamas and Gaza, Turkey and Iran are in the second category. They at the moment believe that the process of rebuilding of the empire or becoming the center of this empire, and Israel is interested or needs to ask the question whether it has anything to do with them, either to avoid both of them or to confront all three or one of them. From this point of view, I believe that the game is not over.
Well, we're drawing near to the end of the program, so I'd like to give each and every one of you the opportunity to have a closing statement. Colonel Ben Shalom, we'll start with you.
Well, with all these strategic calculations, bottom line, the question is what to do. And as far as policy of activating the IDF on the ground, I think the policy as of now is correct, which is maintaining the red line first, the border itself. So every spillover, every rocket, every jet that crosses over must be shot down or met with lethal fire. And the second thing is, of course, the red line that the government has defined of preventing strategic munitions from reaching Iran and reaching Hezbollah. And it's quite rare that the Israeli government has a very clear policy and that they also withhold this red line. So I think the policy right now is correct.
Mr. Owen?
Historically, Israel used to view Syria as a second fiddle. Usually Egypt as well as Iraq were the major Arab military powers. But after the Israeli peace with Egypt, Syria became the major military threat until the civil war. And the Israeli Defense Forces were always designed to block a Syrian armored thrust and trained in order to fight the Syrians. Once the Syrian civil war started, Israel didn't have a real impact on it, but now that the war is about to end, it apparently can play a major role.
Well, for many years, we enjoyed the status of villa in jungle, meaning we were out of the, at least officially, in all this list of conflicts. I'm afraid that this period is about to be over.
Mr. Owen?
Up until the start of the Syrian civil war, and because of the peace with Egypt and Jordan, Syria was considered what in military circles is called the threat of reference. This was the threat against which the Israeli Defense Forces prepared and trained. For the last 7 years or so, this threat disappeared. It may reappear. But ironically enough, during the war, Israel had no impact on what was going on. It clandestinely gave information, gave intelligence to the coalition, but the impact was marginal. Now that the war is about to be over, Israel is holding a very strong card because it can insist on fighting the Iranians, and because the Russians and the others want the country to be stabilized, they have to follow suit.
Professor Hanin, I'd like to ask you one more question specifically on the matter of Putin's announcement about the $200 billion that need to be allocated in order to rebuild Syria. To what degree is this a realistic figure? And it doesn't seem like the Europeans are on board, neither are the Americans, unless some concessions are made towards the Western powers.
It's very unlikely, but that this sum will be raised, but it's very important for Putin to be the first in line to say that he's preparing himself to the day after, whenever it will come.
Reuven earlier said that Erdogan is not crazy. It's a crazy world where there are sanctions that the United States put on Russia. It put sanctions on Iran. It is allied with Russia in Syria, and against Iran it is not. So how does Putin participate in such a deal when he is still under sanctions regarding the Ukraine and Crimea? Maybe Trump can solve it, but it seems right now very complicated.
Colonel Ben Shalom, one sentence?
No, I agree that this is absolutely a political statement in order to send the message, that we're the ones that are calling the shots in Syria. Also, I would say look at other troubles in the Middle East, and we declare that we need money, but money is not the issue.
Well, this is all the time that we have for today, so I'd like to thank Colonel Ben Shalom, Mr. Oren, and Professor Hanin for coming here today.
Thank you.
And I'd like to thank our viewers as well, and we will see you next time. TV7 Israel's mission is to give you, our viewers, truthful information, which in effect will give you a chance to really understand what is happening in Israel and its region. If you're blessed by our programs and believe our mission to be important, we urge you to support us and become a voice for Israel. You can support us by going to our website at tv7israelnews.com. This program was made possible through your donations.